And now I am glad to invite Professor George Kennaway, outstanding cellist and scholar, and his renowned career affiliated with numerous prestigious UK and Western European institutions. And his research area in his 2 books and numerous other publications is related to historical and contemporary performance, topic theory, ekphrasis, and also very important area, I guess, and especially for us, is Čiurlionis, especially chamber music. And today in his presentation, he will speak about French reception of Čiurlionis during interwar years. So, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here again. In 2005, I published my first ever academic paper at all on Čiurlionis' reception in England. At the time, that topic was proposed to me by the late Ioannis Bruveris, amongst others, who I'm very pleased to remember today. And I thought there was no subject in this material in this topic at all. I was completely wrong. And the paper came out. And 20 years later, I'm talking about Čiurlionis in France. And I'm going to leave out 1 or 2 obvious topics, because I think you are all familiar with this. The most prominent French advocate of Čiurlionis was, of course, Romain Rolland. His interest in Čiurlionis is well known. I'll only briefly mention it here. Rolland first encountered Čiurlionis through an issue, the 1914 issue of Apollon. And in 1917, he wrote to his friend Gaston Thiesson, describing him as a Russian artist. In quite surprising terms. He talks about his maîtrise hallucinée. He talks about his paysage polyphonique, superimposed plains, and famously he called Russia itself is an ocean, the only one in Europe whose abysses have not been explored. What curious fauna still hides in its abyss of humanity, the country of Dostoevsky. Rolland famously called Čiurlionis a Christopher Columbus who had discovered a new world. He was more sophisticated and better informed than quite a few of the French commentators that I will talk about now, but it stemmed from his own interest in the synthesis of the arts, which began before he read Ivanov's essay in 1914. And he wasn't the only French person to have read Apollon, as I'll show in a moment. He knew some of Čiurlionis' music as well as its art, and he noticed its contrapuntal nature. Rolland, therefore, belongs with those who saw Čiurlionis as a symbolist artist. The other person I'm not going to talk about today, just for reasons of time, is Sophia. There are more mentions of Sophia's name in the French press from the late 1920s onwards than of her late husband. There's an interview with her. She talks briefly about Michaloius, but not in any detail. But politically, she's a very interesting figure, and I think she's well worth a separate study. Lithuania's history included the French long before Čiurlionis' time, but I won't summarize this today. Later in the 19th century, however, Lithuanian refugees fled to France after the failed 1861-62 uprising. And the Lithuanian Society, Jelmor, was established there in 1866, and items from the Society's library were used in the Lithuanian section of the 1900 Paris World Exhibition. And this is from an article in Lituanus by Čiurlionis. Here's a model form, a pirkia, and here is the model form, also shown in the World Exhibition. There were other displays in that exhibition in Paris of national clothes, artworks, fabrics, books, maps, and examples of the banned press. That aroused a lot of interest. The French press covered the ban on Latin characters in Lithuania and indeed protested about it. There was therefore some general awareness of Lithuania in France before independence. But if the French knew a little about Lithuania, did they know Čiurlionis? Well, in 1996, the journal Die Graph, edited by Serge Fauchereau, devoted an entire issue to Čiurlionis. Nathalie Laurent's reaction to the 2001 Paris exhibition suggested this was still true. The name Čiurlionis is practically unknown in France and scarcely known in the rest of the world. And I think we've heard one or two other papers that quote similar comments from other countries. It's not unique to France. But there was a time when his name was slightly more known. Čiurlionis was exhibited in Paris from 20th of June to the 9th of July 1910 at the exhibition of Jeunes Artistes Russes. The exhibition was put on by the Bernheim Jeune Gallery by Félix Fénéon, which was a center for the avant-garde, showing Impressionist, Post-Impressionist, Cubist, and Futurist art. 128 pictures by 17 artists were included. And here's an advertisement in the Ancienne Gazette des Étrangers, and I've blown up the relevant paragraph here. It lists all the painters, and Čiurlionis is right at the end. Unfortunately, this exhibition was barely reviewed at all, and Čiurlionis was never mentioned in the Parisian press at that time. Now, Audris Pliopoulos, back in 1978, tried to explain this by suggesting that Čiurlionis' paintings just never arrived because he couldn't understand why the press didn't mention Čiurlionis. And the truth is, I'm afraid to say, they weren't interested. But here is the catalogue, and you can see Čiurlionis is listed there, just with 7 fairy tales, and Le Fantôme, which is the painting we now know better as Vitis. It was called Le Fantôme when it was reproduced in Apollon a year or two later. And the catalogue included a reproduction of this well-known painting by Čiurlionis, obviously in black and white, called Le Paradis. Rather nicely done. He did make an impression, however, on the French symbolist poet Rémy de Gourmont. Like Roland, he found Čiurlionis in the 1914 Apollon. He couldn't read Russian, so he only knew the reproductions of the paintings. And he immediately wrote about Čiurlionis in an article called Peinture Russe in La France in 1914, almost straight away. He seized on Čiurlionis as being much better than the Cubists, Picasso and Picabia. He found Cubism laborious, not seductive, monotonous, and un peu vulgaire. Čiurlionis did not paint the ocean, he says, with waves and boats. He painted his dream about the ocean. And Gourmont asks if Čiurlionis knew George Minnes's designs for Maeterlinck's early plays. I don't know why he asks this question. I cannot see any connection between these pictures and Čiurlionis, but nonetheless, Rémy de Gourmont found it. Might have been because of its abstract elements of various kinds. But he says at once, and this is very important, he says that Čiurlionis is unreal and true, natural and fantastic. He thought that Čiurlionis was better than Odilon Redon, because Redon's drawings remained as a literary impression, while Čiurlionis, he says, creates the impression he wants to give directly, and his means are purely pictorial. De Gourmont also connects Čiurlionis with the symbolist movement. After independence in 1918, Lithuania was looking for a stronger diplomatic and political relationship with France. And this little journal appeared not for very long, L'Europe Orientale, published an article signed Lietuvis, that was the name of the author, Lietuvis, in November 1919, describing Vilnius and Lithuania. The writer traces the place of Vilnius in Lithuania's cultural life, in particular from 1905, when compulsory Cyrillic ended. And Lietuvis notes the foundation of the Seimas and how the Lithuanian Scientific Society was particularly concerned with studies of folklore and collected large numbers of folk songs. He described how the Lithuanian Artists Association was founded d'après un projet du peintre Čiurlionis Zmaidzinavičius. He says how this association promoted young artists and organized exhibitions with sections for their works and for objets fabriqués par les paysans. Čiurlionis is named as one of the originators of this cultural development. This time, he's connected with Lithuanian folk culture. This connection was underlined some years later when the Kaunas Museum opened its section of Lithuanian folk art in 1928. And this was covered in several French newspapers. Albert Mousset described this museum in a long article in the Journal des Débats. He was a journalist and historian who specialized in Eastern Europe. He summarizes Lithuanian history, culture, economics, and then describes the language and the folk music. The language, he says, is souple et rythmé, flexible and rhythmic, without dissonance ni vulgarité, so that rough expressions had to be made in Russian or German. And then he talks of this museum, and he says you have to mention the compositions of Čiurlionis, the musician who died in 1911, who decided to ask his brush to express his inspiration more fully. And he talks about a room of Čiurlionis' paintings devoted to this colorful music. He'd also described the folk art in the Kaunas Museum, which showed the famous pensive Christ wood carving that reflected the peasants' souffrance, which he describes as tout un atavisme de résignation et de solitude. And then Čiurlionis appears as both composer and artist, and he says that he took up painting to express his ideas more fully than by music alone. Moving on. The composer Vytautas Bacevičius, whose name has already been mentioned quite a few times, who lived in France for 3 years from 1927 to 30, wrote a long article for Le Ménestrel in 1929 about la musique lituanienne. And that's a brief quotation. He gave a lot of space to folk music, which he called an essential mode of expression for the deepest and most original movements of the soul of the race. Lithuanian diners were evidence of une haute civilisation préhistorique. He also describes traditional instruments like the kankles, and then he turned to classical music. Čiurlionis, he says, is the father of Lithuanian Impressionism, while Bacevičius himself, he calls himself an ultra-expressionist. I think that's quite true. He ends by noticing a French translation of some 26 dinos by the symbolist poet Oscar Miloš, poète français éminent, that had appeared in the Revue de France in 1928. This is a slight digression, but follow me. Miloš, also known as Oskaras Milasius, was independent Lithuania's first envoy to France. And here I note, by the way, that one of the things that Vytautas Landsbergis did, not only was he, of course, a musicologist, but when he was president, he appointed another musicologist as the French ambassador. I just mentioned that. He also endorsed another Lithuanian painter whose name has already appeared today, strongly influenced by Čiurlionis. This was Kazys Šimanis. And the exhibition of Šimanis was at a gallery called Au Sacre du Printemps, that showed contemporary art, obviously, by Picabia, Ernst, or Miro, and surrealists. And Le Siècle reviewed that exhibition, quoting Miloš, and Miloš describes the role of Lithuania in very, very complicated terms. But he repeats a very familiar trope about Lithuania as being between East and West. And we're all familiar with this from the work of Čiurlionis. And Čiurlionis and Šimonis helped Lithuania to connect Aryan Christianity, Polish paracletism, and the esoteric doctrines of Lithuanian Jews. This is what I sometimes call the betweenness quote, where Lithuania is always described as between one thing and another. The thing varies. But that's quite a complicated series of references, which I'll leave you to digest. Moving on. In 1929, a long description of the Baltic republics by a pseudonym, Jacques de Cousanges, wasn't the real name, appeared in Le Correspondant. That was a pseudonym of Barbe Calimard du Genestou, Madame Pierre de Kyrier. You can see why she wanted a pseudonym that was shorter than her real name. She translated Ibsen and other Scandinavian literature into French and was a member of the Académie Française. She described the pagan imagery found in churches and cemeteries unique to Lithuania. And they existed, she said, because Polish or German priests did not speak Lithuanian. Cousanges meets many French-speaking Lithuanians, including young people going to the Sorbonne and other French institutions. Like Musset, she describes the wood carving of the pensive Christ, and she writes about Čiurlionis. Čiurlionis and traditional wood carvers both express something that transcends reality. And here is what she says, the mystical powers of the Lithuanian soul. The historian and philosopher Josef Barutzy wrote in some detail about a concert of Lithuanian music he attended given by Bacevičius in 1929. He heard several pieces by Bacevičius, which he called Toute page de noble élan, de complexe et ample intention, and works by Gruodis and Čiurlionis. He says about Čiurlionis, he says a lot. He calls him a Renaissance man. He talks about his collection of folk songs. He talks about the forest and the sea. And he talks about a fugue in the edition published in Kaunas by the Lithuanian Ministry of Public Education. And this is, of course, the edition made by Stasys Šimkus. Not only that, but this is what he's referring to. And thank you, Darius, for the images you sent me. His last completed fugue, VL 345, was given with the Fugasocian at the top of the page. And this writer, Bossin, has obviously seen this, which gives some evidence of the dissemination of this music. He also describes, he says it should be better known in France, by the way, he also describes how his friends in Warsaw had a work by Čiurlionis in their dining room. He doesn't say who the friends are. He doesn't say what the painting is. I think it could be the Wollman family. I think it could be Bronislava Wollman, who still owned some of Čiurlionis' paintings in 1933. But that's just a guess. I have no idea. In the same year, 1933, the Estonian Aino Pusta, the daughter of Estonia's foreign minister, wrote a series of articles for Les Cahiers de l'Union Européenne. And as a British person, I have to say, I wish there was such a journal now, for political reasons that I don't need to explain. A journal of the European Union about European capitals, including Kaunas. She describes Kaunas with affection for his mixture of modern and traditional architecture, and ends up by saying, we would love to make the trip to Kaunas again to see the Čiurlionis Museum, which gave us an unforgettable memory. If Čiurlionis' life was short, it was productive. If we regret his death, we don't regret its cause, madness, for it is to this madness that we owe his strange genius. The Čiurlionis Museum will be a place of pilgrimage for all those who seek the unfindable. Čiurlionis' ambiguity was also key for the journalist Madeleine Léger, who found Nordic sensations in his paintings. And she talked to us particularly about this painting, Silence, a pastel. The reproduction doesn't look so grey-green to me, but it is the same piece. She doesn't know what it is. Is it a plane? Is it a lake? Is it a piece of sky? In any case, it is silence. Now, moving slightly sideways, Čiurlionis was on the radio. There were several radio broadcasts in France of modern Lithuanian music by composers including Čiurlionis. In 1931, you could listen to Radio Kaunas's broadcast of music by Naujalis, Kazimieras Banaitis, Čiurlionis, we don't know what the pieces were, Gruodis and Bacevičius. In 1935, Radio Paris brought a program with no details of Čiurlionis, Banaitis, Gruodis, Talap Kelpsa, and Stasys Šimkus, performed by Madame Matulaitite et Smilgaitė Dvarionenė. Gražina Matulaitite was a soprano married to Alexis Ranit, the Estonian poet later involved in the abstraction controversy with Kandinsky. And Aldona Smilgaitė Dvarionenė was a pianist married to the composer Balis Dvarionas. A European concert from Kaunas, relayed via Vienna in 1937, consisted of music by Gruodis, Karnavicius, a chorus from his opera Gražina, Antanas Racionas, an extract from his opera Tris Talismanai, Šimkus, Talap Kelsa, and Čiurlionis's piece, which was described in German as Das Meer, Symphonische Dichtung, which sounds altogether more substantial than 19th century than it would do in French. By contrast, I have to say, the first broadcast of his music on the BBC in the UK that I can find was in 1977. I'm near the end. In November 1938, the journal Syrinx published a short article about Čiurlionis by the Belgian artist André Comer, referred to in a letter by Romain Rolland to Nikolai Vorobyov. But Rolland misidentified the name of the journal and the name of the author, so that in 1994, Stasys Gostautas could not find it for his anthology of the Čiurlionis literature. This article brings together the two threads of French reception, Čiurlionis in the context of folk music and his mysticism. Comer describes Jura in this article as a powerful work rich in inspiration and personality, revealing new horizons, echoing Roland, I think. He finds many points of contact between the art and the music, so the listener and spectator can have similar sensations. Ideally, he says, one would be able to hear Čiurlionis's compositions in an instant, just as one sees a painting in an instant. And I think that echoes a remark of Kandinsky's that Philip Bullock quoted yesterday. Or, he says, you could do it the other way around, looking at the painting, trait par trait, couleur par couleur, looking at it in little pieces like a piece of music. The harmony between painting and music, he says, is cosmic harmony. And Comer says we must attend to the pagan mentality of the Lithuanian people and their pantheistic tendencies. In ancient times, he says, Lithuanians did not worship idols, but the forces of nature themselves. Čiurlionis leans on this past and tries to penetrate the mystery of the simple countryside. He poses the eternal problems of the existence of God, good, and evil. That is massively overstated, but that's what he says. His work, he says, is only accessible to an elite. But once understood, it is fascinating and deeply moving. And he ends with a reproduction of Čiurlionis's painting of Samogitian crosses and sees them as a mixture of the architecture of the East and Western crosses. Once again, East meets West, and the past meets the present. This is only an amusing sideline. From 1970, this awful magazine was published in Soviet Russia as pure propaganda. and translated into several foreign languages, not English as far as I know, but certainly French. And Čiurlionis, who has won the Lenin Prize, he described the work of Čiurlionis. There is nothing unusual in this article at all, but I just think it's amusing that on the front cover we have a picture about hunting wolves in Siberia, and here in the middle we have this piece with a reproduction of Rex, which is really not bad by the standards of those days. I just thought that would be amusing. The French saw Čiurlionis differently from the English. English reviewers of the 1911 Post-Impressionist exhibition saw him as spiritually Russian. One writer talked of his mystical passions, and he was seen as part of a wider claim that Russian art was Byzantine in origin. On the other hand, in 1928, the Russian connection was totally denied. Paulius Galaune strongly asserted that Lithuanian folk art's use of abstraction clearly separated it from Russian animal symbolism. He did that in French, by the way. The English lost interest in Čiurlionis, I'm sorry to say. But the French were more enthusiastic. They saw more connection with existing French culture, particularly the symbolist movement, but they also saw a stronger connection with folk art. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and we have some time for questions. Yes, please, Vita Grodite.
Thank you very much for this really very interesting presentation. I would ask just one question. Do you think that the interest for Russian painters with Čiurlionis actually was provoked by Russian ballets and Diaghilev seasons in Paris?
Exactly. That is the reason. The exhibition in 1910 in Paris was almost entirely of theatre designs, Bakst in particular, some Dobzhinsky actually, Röhrig also for the theatre, but they were almost all theatre designs. And I can't remember the numbers right now, but there were well over 20 theatre pictures by Bakst, for instance. And Čiurlionis was, at this time, or had recently been quite interested in theatre design. There's the famous curtain design that's in Kaunas. And I think that was why he was included. But his paintings are certainly not theatrical, the ones that they seem to have used. But yes, that was the main interest. It was certainly to do with that, yeah.
Yes, please, Haris.
I would like to ask, considering this Vienna exhibit about Das Meer.
Oh, yes.
Are there any other from the German-speaking world, or you just found only this?
I found that one because I was looking for radio broadcast in France, so it was relayed from there. I did spend an afternoon browsing to see what Austrian or German interest there might have been in Čiurlionis generally before the Second World War. And I came up with so little that I couldn't find anything at all. I'm quite surprised, really, given that, I don't know how to put this, but Germany is rather nearer than France. But yeah, I don't know. It is an area I'd like to look at sometime. But so far, there doesn't seem to be so much interest.
Yeah, there was a concert that took place in Kaunas and what broadcast.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah,
yes,
and
yes.
I'm interested, for example, that was probably a review or an announcement.
Yes, yes.
So if there were other announcements in other newspapers of other cities, German speaking.
It's quite possible.
Quite possible.
Yes, it is quite possible, yeah. Once you get to the 1930s, it's much easier to research radio broadcasts.
37 it was the
Yeah, exactly. Yes, 37.
37.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, more questions? I have one short question. Speaking of emigre culture presence in France, I also, not only Russian emigre culture, but also we could remember the historically large Polish
Yes.
culture emigration.
Yes.
I wonder if there is any commentaries on the relationship of Čiurlionis with Polish cultural context, or it was not interesting for French commentators?
The ones I've seen don't mention Poland at all in connection with Čiurlionis. No one makes that connection at all, even though Paris is actually full of much older monuments and inscriptions commemorating aristocrats and people from the old Grand Duchy of Lithuania and Poland. And there is monumental evidence in Paris going back to the 16th century to do with Lithuanians. And you'll see Lithuanian coats of arms sometimes on buildings. It's quite extraordinary. But the Polish connection isn't made, although I didn't mention this in my talk, but one of the French sources I looked at, I think the lady who was traveling around all the Baltic states, she did notice that in Kaunas, there was a certain amount of anti-French feeling because the French sided with Poland, and at that time, of course, Vilnius was in it. Yes, exactly. And they picked up that there was some anti-French feeling at that time in Kaunas. I don't know if that's a well-known historical thing, but... Yeah.
So it's possible to speak about some political influences
Absolutely.
to reception of Čiurlionis during the war period?
I think any larger study of this area would have to embrace a much wider political context, because there are French people writing about Lithuania and Lithuanian people writing about France, and sometimes they write in French, and but the connections are much more complicated than what I suggested today.
So thank you very much for you and other speakers. One more question, please, Rytis.
Thank you very much. I'm just curious how much Čiurlionis is known in Great Britain today, nowadays.
I can actually tell you about that. 2 years ago, the Dulwich Picture Gallery put on a very large exhibition of Čiurlionis. With the cooperation of the Čiurlionis Museum in Kaunas, and I met the director there. They asked me to give a talk. I was at the first, at the private view. It got a lot of very sympathetic reviewing in the press at that time. And I think that people did go away. I walked around looking at paintings that I know very well, seeing little British people looking at these pictures and exclaiming with surprise. You know, they made a big impression. I talked in my little talk more about the music because that wasn't so much part of the exhibition. But yeah, I think it is more well known, especially because Grażyna Dyzatila did both his symphonic poems with the City of Birmingham Orchestra quite often, not just in Britain, but when they went on tour as well. So I think the name is better known. It certainly was totally unknown when I started working on him. But that has perceptibly changed. And I think there is, and to be honest, unfortunately, in the current political climate, it works to the countries like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, I know you're not all the same, that there is more interest in the Baltic, generally speaking, more political interest. There's a recent book by Oliver Moody, which was completely a revelation to me about all the Baltic countries in recent history. And I think Čiurlionis appears in this book. So yeah, he is more well known, certainly. Yeah.
So thanks again all the presenters for the rich presentations. And